the broad topic of theory of distribution, we are going to discuss about demand for labor. And we know that in labor market, rate of wage is determined by the interaction between demand for labor and supply of labor. Our first lecture on the wage rate determination is on demand for labor, and when we come to the issue like demand for labor, then we have to discuss about various issues. For example, there may have competitive environment or perfect competition in the labor market and product market, or there may have imperfect competition in the product market or labor market. First of all, we will discuss the situation or how demand for labor may be generated where perfect competition exists both in the product market as well as in the factor market. Classical version of determination of demand for labor is a simplified version, and the simplified version says that labor is the only variable factor used in the production process. That means other than labor, that is capital, land, organization, all factors of productions are assumed to be fixed or constant, and it may be assumed that there is perfect competition in the product market as well as there is perfect competition in labor market also. So if we assume perfect competition in the labor market, then we can say that price of the labor, that is wage rate, is fixed, and under fixed wage rate supply of labor is perfectly elastic, that is labor supply curve is perfectly horizontal. In this situation, it may also be assumed that technology is given. Under competitive environment, we know that production process is followed by a particular law. That law is law of variable proportions. When we are assuming that labor is the only variable factor, then actually we are thinking about a situation that is production process is going on under short run. So short run production process is governed by a particular law, and that law is law of variable proportions. Here labor is employed, more and more labor is employed with fixed capital. As a result, marginal productivity of labor diminishes as there occurs more employment of labor. That means marginal productivity curve of the labor is downward sloping. Now this can be explained with the help of a diagram. Let us see the diagram. When labor is the only variable factor, then marginal productivity of labor curve is downward sloping. Now if we multiply each marginal physical productivity for each unit of labor employment with the price of the product, then we get value of marginal physical productivity curve. Since marginal productivity curve is downward sloping and price is assumed to be constant, then we can say that VMPL curve is also downward sloping. So under this situation, VMPL curve is considered as the labor demand curve, because VMPL actually represents marginal contribution of each additional unit of labor. So producer will demand according to the VMPL curve, and in this case already we have assumed that with fixed wage rate supply of labor is perfectly elastic, that is it is horizontal straight line. So equilibrium labor employment is determined by the interaction between downward sloping VMPL curve and the horizontally sloped supply of labor curve. And if the producer employs labor below L star level, then what happens? The marginal contribution of labor becomes larger than its marginal cost, because wage rate may be assumed as the marginal cost to the producer. So producer will employ up to the point where VMPL curve intersects the supply of labor curve. So this is the simplified version of labor demand, and this is actually classical version. And if we relax the assumption that in the production process only variable factor is labor, then the situation becomes bit complex. Assume that all the factors of production are variable, that is labor is variable, capital is variable, all the factors of production are variable, then the situation alters drastically. For example, earlier it was seen that labor demand depends only on wage rate. Now what is happening, demand for labor actually depends on demand for other factors also. For example, if there occurs drop in the rate of interest, then rate of interest drop means producer will demand more capital in the production field. Now if capital is employed more, then demand for labor will naturally decline. So demand for labor not only depends on its own factor, but also it will depend on other factors or demand for other factor of productions also. So now we cannot think VMPL curve as the labor demand curve. So when all the factors are variable, then we cannot consider the value of marginal productivity curve as the labor demand curve. Let us see the situation in a graphical exposition. When we relax the assumption that labor is the only variable factor, now we are assuming all the factors are variable, that means labor is variable and capital is also variable. If labor and capital both are variable, then the situation may be dealt with some tools or some technique, and that technique is known as isoquant analysis. Here we have drawn, or we are trying to show the entire effect with the help of the diagram showing in the monitor. Now this is the initial situation. Let us consider first panel 1, and initially there was a particular isocost line and there was a particular isoquant. The producer was producing at point E1, and output was defined by the isoquant, that is Q1. Now this isocost line is drawn for any particular slope, and we know that slope of isoquant is measured by the factor price ratio. Now consider a situation where wage rate drops. Now if wage rate drops, factor price ratio changes and slope of the isocost line also changes. So we are getting a new isocost line, and since this isocost line lies to the right of the initial isocost line, this will become tangent with some isoquant, and this isoquant is showing a higher level of production, that is Q2. Now producer is attaining equilibrium at E3. So the producer is moving from E1 to E3, and this is the total movement, and if we want, we can decompose this total movement into two separate parts. And to decompose the effect, let us consider a hypothetical isocost line, and this hypothetical isocost line is so drawn that it would become tangent to the earlier isoquant at point E2. Now what does this particular isocost line means? This isocost line means that if the producer is allowed to produce the earlier production, then he can do so, but since factor price ratio has changed, slope of the isocost line has changed, so he can produce at point E2 in the new situation. Now producer is first moving from E1 to E2 and then from E2 to E3, and this movement can be regarded as substitution effect, because in this case producer is employing more labor due to wage rate decline, and it is actually substituting capital by labor. Now if the producer finally allows to spend all the unspent cost of production, then he will again reach the point E3. So the movement from E2 to E3 may be known as output effect. So the first movement, that is movement from E1 to E2, is known as substitution effect, and the movement from E2 to E3 is known as output effect. For the operation of these two effects, what happens? The employment of labor or demand for labor increases grossly. When the producer is moving from E1 to E2, then producer actually increases labor employment from L1 to L2, and the movement from E1 to E2 or conversely from L1 to L2 is known as substitution effect. And the movement from E2 to E3 or increase in employment from L2 to L3 is known as output effect. Here we may think that the point E3 is the point of final equilibrium. That means producer will employ up to L3 amount of labor. But actually this is not the case. When wage rate decreases, then what happens? Before the decrease in wage rate, there was a definite marginal cost of the producer, and the producer made his equilibrium in the product market by the equality between P and MC, and was producing Q1 level of output. Now when wage rate decreases, then what will happen? With the let us see the diagram showing in panel 2. When wage rate decreases, then what is happening? Marginal cost of the producer will decrease. That means marginal cost curve will shift downward, and as marginal cost curve shift downward, then we are getting another intersection point between marginal cost and price, that is at point C. Earlier the intersection point was A, now the intersection point is C, where the new marginal cost curve has intersected the price line. So producer is increasing production and its marginal cost is decreasing. That means producer is going to increase production, and if in this case his total cost of production is also increasing, and the increase in the total cost of production is shown by the shaded rectangle in the diagram. So as producer increases total cost of production, his total production is increasing and his profitability is also increasing. Now with the increase in profitability, there will have another effect. Let us see that effect, and that effect is shown in the panel 3. This is the initial situation as shown in the panel 1, and we have already marked all the points as usual. That is it was up to E3. Now when total cost of production increases, along with production will increase, and with the increase in total cost of production, we can see that there is a shift of the isocost line rightwards. Now at the new isocost line, there will have some tangency of with any higher isoquant Q3. So Q3 touches or becomes tangential with the new isocost line at E4. So E4 may be considered as the point of final equilibrium. So there occurs another effect. Earlier we had two effects. One was substitution effect and the other one was output effect. Now we are having another effect. We can say that from the movement from E3 to E4 or the movement from L3 to L4 may be regarded as profit maximizing effect. And finally we are getting these different points in the, according to these three panels, we may say one thing, that when the wage rate decreases, then marginal productivity of labor first decreases, then increases. Now why it is happening? If we see the first diagram, that is and in first diagram we can see that the first movement was between E1 to E2 and it was known as substitution effect. In this case, marginal productivity of labor decreases. Why decreases? Because in this case what is happening, producer is employing more labor but it is reducing employment of capital. That means now the laborer has to work with less number of machines or less number of capital. So the marginal productivity of labor decreases in case of substitution effect. But in case of output effect we can see that both employment of labor and capital increases. That means more labor is now working with more capital. So if each labor is given higher dose of capital, then its marginal productivity also increases. And from the third diagram, that is from panel 3, we can also see that both the employment of labor and capital is increasing. That means labor is now working with more and more capital, so marginal productivity also increases. So for substitution effect, marginal productivity of labor decreases. For output effect and profit maximizing effect, marginal productivity of labor increases. And it is generally seen that summation of output effect and profit maximizing effect is generally greater than substitution effect. So due to wage fall, generally what happens, marginal productivity curve shifts to the right or VMPL curve shifts to the right. Here we are showing a situation, first situation where wage rate was W1 and this was the VMPL curve. Now as wage rate decreases to W2, what is happening? As wage rate decreases to W2 then due to the operation of output effect and profit maximizing effect, marginal productivity of labor curve shifts to the right. As a result, VMPL curve also shifts. So we are getting another VMPL curve. Similarly, when wage rate drops to W3, then again we are getting another VMPL curve. Now from these three VMPL curves, if we take the locus, that means locus of points like A, B and C, then we will get the demand for labor curve. So this is the demand for labor curve under the assumption that all the factors of production are variable, and this is actually a long run situation which is different to the short run situation. And from the short run situation, if we compare between short run situation and long run situation, we can say that this particular demand for labor curve is more flatter than the short run case. So these are all from demand for labor under a competitive environment, and we have seen that two situations were there. Two situations are there. One is with only labor is the variable factor, and the other situation is that where all the factors of production are variable. So that's all for today's class. Thank you all.